Welcome to the bonus show, where we have now not only the clip of Alex Jones talking about the bonus show, we also now on the soundboard, I have Howard Stern.
A David Pakman membership costs $6 a month.
Yeah, David Pakman membership costs $6 a month. We're really building up quite a picture of different prominent folks' opinions about the bonus show, aren't we?
That is pretty cool. Yeah, we're going to need maybe Trump and Biden talking about the
Yeah.
membership program and the bonus show too. I was also thinking that it might be nice to do a crowdfunding campaign to get Howard Stern a membership because he's
Yeah.
unwilling to pay the $6 a month or even less potentially. But, maybe we can get the audience members to support his membership.
Yeah, with some of those borderline criminal coupon codes, he wouldn't even be out the full $6 a month. So anyway, something to look into. All right, let's get right into it. The Supreme Court is putting some First Amendment limits on laws that ban online threats. This is extraordinarily relevant, not only to me, because I get so many online threats, but also just from the standpoint of speech and what are the lines, what are the restrictions on speech in the online space. A New York Times report reports that the Supreme Court ruled yesterday that the First Amendment does put some limits on the laws that make it a crime to issue threats on the internet. Understand the wording. It's not that the First Amendment puts limits on the threats you can send. The First Amendment puts limits on the laws you can pass about threats that are sent. It was a 7-2 decision. The state must show that the defendant consciously disregarded a substantial risk that his communications would be viewed as threatening violence. The state need not prove any more demanding form of subjective intent to threaten another. And what Justice Kagan wrote in her opinion is that there are, quote, true threats like libel, incitement, obscenity, and fighting words, which would not be protected by the First Amendment. But at the same time, statements that are mistaken as threats or whatever the case may be with anything that stops short of that requirement would not be subject to punishment and prosecution and consequences in the way that some laws want to do. So, I mean, listen, this all goes back to a story in Colorado law, where a man was prosecuted under a law that says if you send repeated communications that would cause a reasonable person, I mean, look at these, every single one of these words, repeated communications causing a reasonable person to suffer serious emotional distress, then you can be convicted. And indeed, a guy named Counterman was convicted and sentenced to 4.5 years in prison. And of course, lawyers said violates the First Amendment. There was no proof that he intended to do this. There was no proof that he was deliberately being threatened. And, listen, I don't know exactly what my opinion is on this particular finding, Pat, but there is so much subjectivity here that I find it difficult to establish an objective standard with a lot of these things.
Right. To your point, I think this maybe establishes a Goldilocks standard where you can make these online threats so long as they're not too specific and as long as the person who's being threatened doesn't actually think there's a legitimate risk of harm being done to them. And there's this idea that, okay, maybe you can get away with saying something innocuous like this Pac-Man guy really needs to be done away with.
Yeah.
That's going to be viewed as acceptable. Whereas if you have like a specific day and place where some event is going to be carried out and you have the plans to do so and you have like the weapons at the ready, okay, that's the type of thing that can be prosecuted. I think for the most part, a lot of people already suspected that when it comes to these online threats, if we're going to take them seriously, if they're going to be viewed as violations of the First Amendment, they have to meet a certain threshold. It's interesting, though, seeing them come up with what the threshold is going to be, what the qualifications are going to be, especially when, a lot of the people that issue threats like this are not going to be in their right mind. They may be dealing with some sort of mental illness. And so sometimes, not all the time, but to a prosecutor, that's going to be difficult some of the time to have to prove that they actually intended to carry this out when the defense can just say, well, they're dealing with stuff, they're insane, so it's not credible.
The other aspect to this is not about whether they intend to carry out a physical threat, but there's a recklessness standard that's established, which is is the person making the threat aware that the recipient would interpret it reasonably as threatening violence? And if they were aware that the recipient would understand it as threatening violence, and then they still say the thing, that is reckless, and therefore it would not be protected by the First Amendment. But your point is a good one, Pat, which is with a lot of these things, we have words that define what is and isn't okay, but they are words that are very much subject to interpretation. You know, we get messages all the time, and I can analogize from this to lots of the stuff that's happened to the show. I regularly get messages that say, if I ever saw you on the street, you can be sure that I would punch you in the face. When we send anything that's remotely a threat to law enforcement, and law enforcement has been very clear, that's really not actionable as a threat. With a lot of these things and things that have been actionable, they're over state lines. Like that's a big thing for when the FBI gets involved with threats that get sent to us. If I ran into, you'd better hope I don't run into you on the street because I'll punch your face in. It's not specific enough. And even though I think it's reasonable to interpret as a threat, there's no indication that that person is going to try to find me or knows where to find me or whatever the case may be. On the other hand, there was a situation when we were at our old studio in New York, and we had a P.O. box very close to that studio. And an individual, I guess, thinking that I'm like personally going to the P.O. box all the time. It was just like a legal address. It didn't even matter, but they imagined that this was a physical P.O. box that I was going to. They said, I'm going to be waiting for you at that P.O. box with and the individual listed 2 specific guns. This led to, it didn't lead to the guy's prosecution. The guy was based in another part of the country. So it was interstate lines. He had the means in the sense that he was claiming to have these firearms, and an investigation determined he did indeed have those firearms. And it was specific in terms of where it was going to happen. It wasn't when, right? It wasn't when, but it was like the where. That this led to an investigation, investigators coming out, scaring the crap out of this guy by basically saying, what you did here could be a federal felony. Ultimately, the guy wasn't prosecuted because, as with many of these things, Pat, there's not only prosecutorial priorities, but there's also technicalities on which it might be difficult to get a conviction. But this is the FBI ended up telling me, we would be shocked if you ever heard from this guy again. This guy had a lot to lose, and he was absolutely horrified, terrified, and humiliated. So that the difference was what? The individual was saying, with these specific firearms at this particular location, that was clearly over the line when it came to threats.
Yeah, and I think that was carried out well. I think that it would have made sense to prosecute that individual, but if he was scared straight, and if this was something that was going to serve as a warning to him, then that's all well and good. Under this standard, though, if it was applied, maybe there wouldn't even be any threat of prosecution, because once they showed up and realized he wasn't actually serious about it, you wouldn't have the grounds to be able to charge him, right? Because it's not like prosecutors would be able to reasonably prove that intent. And because we're going to state of mind here, not only the state of mind of the perpetrator, but also the victim, I'd have to imagine that raises the bar significantly for prosecutors to even want to charge people on this, because you're only going to charge when you have a reasonable conviction, when you have a reasonable idea that you're going to be able to get a conviction on the charges, right? You want to make sure that it's above, 80% or so. You want to make sure that you have everything you need, all your ducks in a row to get the conviction. So if you are coming up with these state of mind qualifications, and you can't really ever get into anyone's mind with 100% certainty, that leads me to believe that maybe this new standard the Supreme Court has ruled is going to lead to fewer prosecutions.
There's certainly obstacles that we can say for sure. The state of Delaware is known for being very business friendly, and there is one city in Delaware that is now looking to allow companies to vote. Yes, corporations are people in this sense. We're talking about the town of Seaford. It's only 8,000 people, and they've amended their charter to let LLCs, corporations, trusts, and partnerships vote in local elections. They will not be allowed to vote in state elections. They will not be allowed to vote in national elections. And this law would go into effect once both houses of Delaware's state legislature approve it. So this is once again a question of, what is the amount of power that corporations should have? Could I register 10 LLCs for $500 a pop and now get 10 additional votes every single year. One of the reasons this is even being done is low turnout. There's been low turnout in municipal elections. And the idea was, if we let businesses have a vote as if they were people, then maybe we will increase turnout. Now, according to Delaware Online, there are 234 such entities. And you might say, wow, David, that's really not a lot. There's 234 possible votes from all of these. But in April, they had a municipal election where only 340 people voted. So you're talking about like 60% of the current electorate. I don't love this. I have to tell you, Pat, I don't love this. Seaford also is unique in that it's one of only a few towns that allows absentee property owners to vote on certain issues just by virtue of holding property. Usually you're only allowed to vote where your residence is. But Seaford and a few other Delaware towns say if you own property, even if you don't live there, you can still vote. I don't know. I'm not thrilled by this. This seems to be a way to basically buy more votes in many different ways.
Yeah, I think the own property thing is bad enough. I think you should only have one vote in whichever state that you reside, because this type of thing sets up the ability for rich people to be able to vote in all different sorts of elections all around the country, potentially, if other municipalities had the exact same rules. And that doesn't seem fair to me. I think we should stick to the one person, one vote thing. When they talk about turnout, I wonder if they argue that it'll increase turnout because corporations will be voting now, and so that's more total votes, or if the idea is now that people know that corporations are also voting, that's going to inspire them to want to go out to the polls. But if it's that second one, I'm not so convinced of that. I think that may lead to more apathy, more people realizing that, oh, well, these corporations are going to be able to outvote us, and it's not like we, the people, have much of a say in these things anymore. So I think this is a disastrous idea. I don't think that corporations should be allowed to vote. But when you look at like how the law has gone in this country and how we've made changes to the rules to essentially be able to say that, well, corporations are people too, and corporations have free speech rights, it's not surprising that there are certain places that want to allow them to vote as well.
One other note on this, there are a handful of other Delaware towns that allow corporations to vote. And there is an example of where was this? This was in Newark, Delaware, where a single property manager had LLCs for each property and was able to vote 31 times legally. You know, Trump and Republicans talk about people voting multiple times. Here's a place where people are legally voting multiple times through property holding. So we'll follow it. We'll see where it goes. Senator Mark Wayne Mullen, who's a Republican senator from Oklahoma, really a horrible guy. We've talked about him before. He's challenging a union boss to an MMA fight. And it would be for charity. This would be for charity. And this all relates. We covered the source of this animosity. There was this hearing where the Teamsters boss was questioned by Mark Wayne Mullen during a Senate hearing a few months ago. And it was all about how much do you make and what's your salary and all this different stuff. And it escalated quite a bit. And now Mark Wayne Mullen tweeted out that he wants to fight the dude in an MMA fight for a charity of their choice and is giving 3 days to accept. I have to tell you that I think that this is just a copycat, Pat, to the recent dust up about how Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg were going to be doing some kind of jujitsu match or something along those lines until Elon Musk's mommy said that he's not allowed to do it. This is all so stupid.
Yeah, it's so childish, and it seems like these senators in particular and, you know, big CEOs who have a lot to lose don't want to just say, all right, let's fight or anything like that, because that could be seen as not only childish, but also illegal. But they have this out by saying, oh, well, it'll be a sanctioned MMA match. So it's more like a sport. I've seen that crop up a lot over recent years. Like before, you'd have to either just challenge someone to a fight and accept all the risks when it comes to backlash. But it almost seems like, okay, well, if this is a sanctioned thing, then it's somewhat acceptable to do. But regardless, this is unacceptable behavior coming from a sitting United States senator. You can't just be challenging people to fights who you disagree with on policy. Stick to the issues, stick to the argument.
Yeah, and obviously they lose on the issues, which is why oftentimes it's culture wars. Now it's physical altercations that they're trying to cause or whatever. Do you care about, you know, for me, even when it comes, we talked about this when it comes to should doctors and scientists debate anti-vaxxers. And one of the things I said was, the debate often doesn't really settle who's right, because the person who's more charismatic or whatever the case may be often wins, even if they don't actually have the facts on their hand. To me, the fight over a political disagreement is even further removed from figuring anything out.
I suppose that's why they're saying we're going to do this for charity rather than we're going to do this to prove who's right in this specific dust-up that we have. Because if you were going to dig into who was right and wrong in that back and forth that they had at that hearing, clearly you're going to come out on the side of the Teamsters boss.
Yeah.
So yeah, when it comes to like this fight in particular, it seems even crazier to me than that debate scenario that you brought up with the anti-vaxxers.
However, I do actually think that Hillary Clinton fighting Sarah Palin would resolve a lot of political issues. I think we would basically figure out tax policy, healthcare policy, and foreign policy if they were to fight.
I mean, I'm not arguing that all of these fights wouldn't be entertaining. I do think
Right.
that they would be entertaining. I'm just saying that they're probably not appropriate, especially when you're talking about the political realm, and it doesn't really make sense. Like it's not like whoever wins and who loses this fight would have any implications for the broader public and how we set policy in this country. It would just be a shit show, I guess we could say.
I think that is exactly my view. So they can do the fights if they want, but I am not going to be coming away with any conclusions about the political state of affairs based on who wins the fight, right? Listen, if Joe Biden fought, who's running on the
Trump,
Well,
remember
forget
that was
about
a whole-
Trump for a
that was
second.
a
Well,
whole
okay,
dust
Trump,
up,
fine.
remember?
The thing is, I don't actually know that Trump would win, but if Joe Biden fought Tim Scott, okay, Tim Scott's in his 50s, I think Tim Scott would win. I'd still vote for Biden, and I'd still likely agree more with Joe Biden on policy. You know what I'm saying?
This is also ridiculous, but yes,
It's
I
absurd.
absolutely 100%
It's absurd.
agree. And the reason I brought up Trump was because in the last election,
He
that was
said,
one of the
yeah.
things he was gonna, and then but maybe actually Biden started it by saying that he was going to like take him to the back of the high school gym. We got to review who started.
We have to review
that
who said what. Yeah, I don't exactly remember. All right, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow. New show, new bonus show. There will be a show Monday, July 3rd. We'll be off on Tuesday, July 4th for a federal holiday. And then it all will continue.